My name is Michael Spicher. I'm located in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a philosopher who has spent nearly 20 years studying aesthetics, which involves thinking about things like beauty, the sublime, aesthetic taste, aesthetic experience, and all sorts of aspects of art. I've wanted to move beyond just this connection between art and nature and bring aesthetics into our everyday context of work, our homes, and see how these areas of our lives are impacted in ways that we often don't think about. When we think about something like aesthetic experience, we think of these really lofty experiences, like standing on the top of a mountain and gazing out at this amazing landscape or seeing the most beautiful painting we've ever seen. But we have a lot of little aesthetic touches in our daily lives I'm trying to help reorient people toward. I tend to work in four main contexts: the beauty industry, fashion industry, mostly digital fashion, business, and architecture. Philosophers and fashion often don't go together. I don't mean just what they wear, but even talking about it. When philosophers talk about aesthetics, and they talk about what we might think of as applied aesthetics, all the arts, painting, sculpture, dance, architecture, music, and so on, they almost never talk about fashion, which is sort of strange to me. So that kind of piqued my curiosity to fashion more generally. What kind of connected me with digital fashion is two things. One was sort of accidental and a chance encounter. I met two people, Sarah Bernat and Doris Domoslai-Lantner. The three of us co-edited a book on digital fashion theory, practice, and implications with Bloomsbury. Talking with them about it kind of piqued my curiosity, but then what gave me more of a sustained interest in it, it relates to digital fashion, but it also goes a little bit beyond that to digital objects more generally. What exactly are these things? What is the nature of their reality? An article written by two philosophers that really became the basis of instigating some thought for me. These two philosophers analyzed a Supreme Court case from the Netherlands where two older teenage boys physically hurt and then continued to physically threaten a younger boy until he logged into the video game RuneScape and dropped two items. I believe it was a helmet and an amulet. And then once he dropped them, one of the older boys logged in and his avatar picked them up. The Supreme Court ruled obviously an assault had taken place, they hurt him, but they also ruled that a robbery had taken place, which is far more interesting to me. Because how can you rob something that doesn't really exist in some sense? So these two philosophers analyzed that, and that kind of piqued my curiosity about what is the nature of digital worlds and objects, and what do these things really mean? It's a question that few people are really asking in any substantial way. We're just being very pragmatic about it, which is, on one hand is fine, but we're not really stepping back and saying, what really are we doing, and what is this really for? Digital fashion provides a unique opportunity to experiment without the limitations of physical fashion. If we were talking about physical fashion, let's say I decide I want to spread my fashion wings as far as they will go and try everything and just really try and figure out what works for me and what doesn't work and what feels most comfortable. We have a lot of limitations. We certainly have real reasons to be worried about how people in the physical world perceive us. Our family, first and foremost. The next layer might be our friends, and then society as a whole. We might be nervous about if we really wanted to make a substantial change to the way we present ourselves in the physical world. We have reason to fear that. Whether we'd get a job or whether people would accept us, whether people would actively do something to harm us. In the digital realm, most digital clothing is much more affordable. You can buy it endlessly, and you get to really experiment with trying things in safe places where people may know your character or your avatar, but they don't really know you, so it doesn't necessarily come back on you. It's not an exact way to experience, but it is a way to really practice and figure out what works so that you could then bring it into the physical world. I think there are two ways of looking at the digital world. Like one is as an escape that has one purpose, and one as a way to help us navigate the real world. In terms of the key philosophical inquiries, there are as many as there are philosophers, to be honest. The key ideas come down to two groups of questions. First, what is the connection between me, my physical self, and my virtual self? Are we the same? Is it okay if my virtual self is different? And how much difference is allowed before my digital self almost becomes someone else? There are two categories here. One is a virtual world that is designed in a sense to mimic, to some degree, the physical world. Like we could imagine having this conversation using digital avatars that look like us, but we're in a digital coffee house or something and just having a conversation. And then there's the other thing that we can just call world of fantasy, where there are dragons and elves and so on. And that might be a whole other connection, where maybe there's a personality connection, but the character looks nothing like me. So I think we have to keep that clear when we're answering that group of questions. But the second question is actually much more succinct, and that is, can we really be anyone online that we want? Are there any limitations? Digital fashion, for example, has been hailed as something that the only limitation is the limits of our imagination. But are there any ethical considerations? Are we responsible for what we wear? Are there things that, just like in the physical world, I shouldn't wear? Are there things in the digital world that I also shouldn't wear based on who I am? Cultural appropriation and identity representation, we can treat them separately. So as far as cultural appropriation, for these comments, I'm talking specifically about the virtual spaces that are designed to be more like the physical real-world spaces, not imagination or fantasy or something. If we're in these real-world spaces that look like an office, that look like a coffee shop or whatever, for cultural appropriation, I think kind of the same rules apply. While it might be fun for me to wonder what I might look like with dreadlocks, I think it would be strange if I made my avatar that looks like me, except with dreadlocks. And I think the reason why it's maybe a little bit more concerning for digital spaces and digital avatars is that it's easy. Like if I wanted right now, if I decided I'm going to go get dreadlocks, well, I have to, it's like years of a commitment to grow it. But, on digital avatar, I can just pop them in really quickly. So I think we have to consider that cultural appropriation is easier in digital worlds because it doesn't take any time, money, or effort. You can instantly change something. As far as identity representation, suppose I'm creating my avatar, but suppose there's a gradation of skin tones from light to dark. So I start with the lightest, and I'm like, well, that's a little too pale. I keep going up the line, and then I eventually get to really dark skin. At some point, it may feel like I crossed a line, and I don't know that there's an exact demarcation. I do think there is a problem with this, and we see this already manifesting in social media websites like Instagram, where white people are presenting themselves as mixed race. It's an issue called blackfishing. They do it with two things. One, they physically alter their bodies. They get extra tan and they change their hair texture as best as they can. But then they use filters and other things, so they enhance it even more with digital tools. So I think this is a problem, but I don't see too many people really talking about this in terms of digital fashion yet. People have been talking about it in terms of Instagram and other social media. So the question, can we really represent ourselves as anything we want? On one hand, let's say I was, or a man, whoever is struggling, maybe they see themselves more as a woman. Maybe the digital environment gives them a chance to see if that's what's really happening. And obviously I'm talking about someone that's actually questioning. Like some people are more sure, of course, but the people that are not sure, it gives them a chance. But then there's the other side where, could I just present myself as a woman just because I feel like it would be fun or something? And it's not about my real identity. There's something there that could cross a line into the exploitative, I think. These are the questions we need to ask. All of these things, it could change from virtual world to virtual world. Like there might be a virtual world where it's completely acceptable to present yourself any which way. And there are obviously some that are from the imagination, but there might also be some where it would be strange to do that. And I think we have to figure that out. And I know that lots of people believe that in the future we're going to have multiple avatars anyway. Like the avatar for professional settings, the avatar for hanging out with friends. I think insofar as we start doing that, are each of these avatars part of of our real selves? Or are they caricatures of our real selves? And it's important to really think about that. The way technology often takes over, we allow it to take over, and then we start wondering, what was it all about? There's many ethical theories. We've limited to two for our discussion: deontology and utilitarianism. Deontology, in its most simple explanation, is just that there are some things that are absolutely wrong and absolutely right. So Immanuel Kant from the 18th century said, you can never, ever tell a lie. His famous example is an axe murderer knocks on your door and wants to kill your friend who's hiding in the back room. And if the axe murderer asks you, is your friend in the house? If you answer, some people say you don't have to answer the question, but if you answer, you cannot say no. It would be immoral. The point is there's no exceptions. They're right or wrong. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, says that there's nothing right or wrong in itself. It all depends on the consequences. Either bringing the greatest good to the greatest number or having the least amount of harm to the greatest number of people. But the problem, of course, with that is can we really predict all consequences of all of our actions? There's definitely all sorts of nuances of theories splintering off these two, but these are two of the basic frameworks of ethical theory. Most philosophers would probably argue something like these two are incompatible with each other. You can't be both. I do think when we consider something like digital worlds, we could apply some of these things to different situations. I think there might be some ways of representing ourselves online that are probably, in fact, not the best way to represent ourselves. Because it's misleading, where our intentions are to misrepresent ourselves. And we might say something like that is just wrong. Whereas we might apply a more utilitarian approach to things that are underdetermined by any kind of other idea of human goodness, where maybe it's okay for me to present myself certain ways. So I don't think there's a rigid way to apply any of these things. I think what these two theories in ethics help us see is that there are different frameworks for thinking about this, and we need to at least be thinking about this, because otherwise we just sort of go out and do whatever without much thought, and that's where I think we get into more trouble. We may not think any of these things solve the issue, but at least if we have a framework for thinking about it, it helps us when we to at least reconsider what it is we're doing. One way that we navigate that notion of digital identity in our online interactions is through remembering that we're all human and prone to mistakes, especially when you look at comments on social media and when people begin to dogpile each other, as it were. When someone seems to slip up, we seem to act as though we have infallible knowledge of each other's intentions. And I think it's a huge mistake and a huge problem. There's some distance between us when we're commenting on social media. When we can look at each other's avatar in the eye, it creates a little bit of humility that isn't there in social media, where we can't do that. So I think really the key isn't much different from the real world. I think the key is empathy. And we can point out where we think other people have maybe gone too far, but we need to do that in ways that are actually constructive instead of destructive. My other hope, specifically in terms of digital fashion, is right now, we talk about how digital fashion is kind of a small world where we kind of all know each other in some ways, or at least we've heard of each other, even if we've not directly interacted. And right now that's true, but as digital fashion becomes bigger, we need to figure out a way to prevent it from becoming institutionalized and bureaucratized. That's the real struggle, is while it's free and experimental and friendly, everything's great. But at some point, when companies start becoming bigger, digital fashion houses have been around for even longer and become more solidified. For the purposes of their business, they might need to be somewhat bureaucratic. As business becomes bigger, it has more parts and has more things to worry about. But as a freedom of expression, I think we need to hold on to that curiosity and creativity that is so important to digital fashion right now. What we need to keep in mind, and sometimes I think people get captivated by what technology can do, that we forget that if it doesn't help us in the real world, in some sense, what good is it? We've already seen some digital worlds to help people cope with some mental health issues. I've read in Matthew Ball's book on the metaverse where there was a country that banned books, and on this one virtual world, they created a library of all the banned books so that people from that country could go in the virtual world and read all the books that they're not actually allowed to read in the physical world because of where they live. So there are really interesting ways in which virtual worlds and virtual reality and digital fashion can help us. I do think there is a nice thing about the escape part of it, so I don't want to diminish that side of it, but I also think we have to recognize that in the long run, these things are tools that should help us live better lives in some ways. Virtual worlds have a way of doing that. There are people that, even just playing video games, where they get to be the hero of the video game, which is an escape from maybe their mundane day job. That kind of thing can actually help regain their confidence in the physical world. And I also hope that it helps us figure things out. It helps us interact with people better. It helps us problem solve. It helps us in other ways. Helps us figure out our own identities, the kind of person we want to be. It could do all that. Whether it will, I think, is up to us. This is why we need to have these conversations now, instead of merely the conversations about the tech and the neat things tech can do. The best piece of advice I have actually been given was about 20 years ago. To set up the advice, I will say that one thing we do as philosophers, we critique arguments. We criticize arguments and ideas. We question assumptions. But hopefully the goal ultimately is to clarify concepts or further some conversation in some way, even if it's a small way. So the advice I was given was based on the idea that it's far more easier to criticize than to understand. So you need to earn the right to criticize. And you do that by two things. First, make sure you understand what it is the person said. So that one seems more obvious. But the second one seemed a little bit more surprising, and this is probably why it stayed with me for so long. You need to learn something from them. And I thought that was really unexpected, but then once you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Like, every philosopher I've read has a substantial amount of education. It doesn't mean they're right, of course. Every scientist I've read, every psychologist, sociologist, everyone I've read has something to offer, even if I ultimately don't agree. I mean, I think we often think if I don't agree with someone, there's nothing I can learn from them. So I thought that was really helpful to repeat. One, understand them. Two, learn something from them. And then you've earned the right to offer some sort of criticism.